First, we're going to turn to one of the main drivers of change in the oceans and carbon. And in spite of and we're going to do this plenary just a little bit differently because we know that there are many of you out there that aren't oceanographers and don't have all of the information that many of us do. So at the risk of breaking Carl's law about people not wanting information, we're going to start with a little bit. So each of our speakers is going to give you a little information snapshot on their topic, and then we're all going to come up and have a discussion and talk to you and answer your questions. So the first snapshot is going to be how all that CO2 from the atmosphere gets into the ocean and what role it plays. And to give us that view, we're very, very pleased to have Kirsten Zickfeld with us. And Kirsten is an assistant professor in the geography department of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC. She is one of the rising stars in ocean science. In 2006, she was selected as one of only 11 young scientists to be awarded distinguished recognition by Germany for all disciplines of all science. And she comes to us as a person who studies climate change mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions, and their interaction with the ocean. Kirsten.
Thanks, Margaret. Good morning, everybody. So what I will do here is talk a little bit about the role of the oceans in the global carbon cycle. So I'll set out and explain what the carbon cycle is. So how is it that carbon that we emit to the atmosphere is moved around in the system? Then I'll talk a little bit about the changes that we are observing with the focus on the ocean. So can we actually detect changes in the way that the ocean is taking up carbon. And then I look a little bit into the future and explain how the role of the ocean in the carbon cycle might change in the future and what this might mean in terms of carbon dioxide that is retained in the atmosphere and how this might affect climate. So first of all, what is the role of the ocean in the carbon cycle? Well, first of all, it's one of the largest reservoirs of carbon. So it stores about 90% of the carbon in the system. And there are also carbon stores on land and in the atmosphere, but those are relatively small. All these carbon reservoirs, they exchange huge fluxes of carbon. So you see those numbers on the slides. So these numbers are in petagrams, which is the equivalent of gigatons of carbon. So this means each of these numbers are billions of tons of carbon that are exchanged between the different reservoirs. And now there are humans who also emit carbon into the atmosphere, and the emission from fossil fuels that we contribute to the system every year are about 7.7 petagrams per year. So compared to the natural fluxes, the emissions by human activities are relatively small. However, these very small emissions have the effect of throwing the entire system out of balance. So the question here is, where do these emissions go? What we know is how quickly the atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing. We know it's increasing at about 4.1 billions of tons of carbon per year. So this is a little bit more than half of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere every year. So where do the other emissions go? We know that about 30% of the remaining emissions go into the ocean, and about 20% or a little bit less than that into the vegetation. So what is it that drives these sinks of carbon, or why is it that both the vegetation and the ocean take up carbon? So on land, the main drivers of the carbon sink is, first of all, CO2 fertilization. So plants grow better in a CO2-rich environment. Then there's also warmer temperatures. So this means that in regions, especially in the north, where growth is temperature limited, a warmer environment leads to more productive ecosystems. Then there's anthropogenic anthropogenic nitrogen deposition, so all the fertilizers that we use in agriculture make their way into natural ecosystem, also spurring their growth. And last but not least, there's regrowth of vegetation on agricultural areas. So areas that have been cleared previously are now regions where vegetation is regrowing. Okay, so these are the main factors that drive the sink of carbon dioxide on land. So what is the main process that governs the sink in the ocean? And this is mainly what is referred to as the solubility pump. So what happens here is that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in ocean waters, and then because of atmospheric circulation, it is transported to the deep ocean. And the main limiting process in this process here is the rate at which the carbon dioxide is removed from the surface ocean. Okay, so this means that with the very vigorous ocean circulation, carbon is removed more quickly from the surface into the deep ocean, and so the sink is enhanced. Ocean biology likely does not play an important role in the anthropogenic sink of carbon or in the uptake of anthropogenic carbon. It plays a very important role for the distribution of natural carbon in the ocean. But in terms of taking up human-made emission, it likely does not play an important role. So where does this carbon go in the ocean? From a number or from a very large global survey of carbon dioxide with about 70,000 samples taken all over the ocean with very good coverage in certain regions and less coverage in other regions, we are able to reconstruct a picture of where the anthropogenic carbon goes in the ocean. And this is shown on this slide here. So areas that are orange and yellowish, these are regions that take up a lot of the anthropogenic carbon. Okay, so what you see here, that most of the anthropogenic carbon ends up in the North Atlantic, and this is a region where this deep circulation takes place, but also in the Southern Ocean. So if you look into to the Southern Hemisphere, there's also a band of greenish colors there, which indicates that there's a huge amount of carbon stored there as well. In fact, it's about 40% of the anthropogenic carbon. So what we see here is that there are two main regions where this carbon ends up. It's mainly the North Atlantic and it's the Southern Ocean. And these are regions where these deep water masses or intermediate water masses form. So how much of carbon dioxide is currently bound in the ocean? And in 2008, the total inventory of anthropogenic carbon is estimated to be about 140 billion tons of carbon. So just to put this in relation, humans so far, or the cumulative emissions or the emissions summed up since the Industrial Revolution are about 500 petagrams of carbon. Okay, so again, this is a little bit less than 30%. So what I'm going to do next is provide some evidence that this oceanic sink of carbon is actually changing and it is weakening, which means that the emissions that we put out into the atmosphere are taken up by the oceans to a lesser extent. And then I will also show how climate models project this ocean sink to change in the future. So there have been a number of studies which have looked at trends in the sink of carbon, and one of those studies was carried out in the Southern Ocean. And what they did is they knew how the carbon dioxide was distributed and how it varied regionally. And from this information, they were able to back out all the fluxes of carbon in the Southern Ocean. And what they concluded in the study is that compared to a case where ocean circulation and climate is not changing, but where only carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, the sink of carbon in the Southern Ocean is actually weakening. and they attributed this to wind changes in the Southern Ocean. So there has been a consistent trend towards stronger westerly winds in the Southern Ocean, which also drives changes in the ocean circulation. And so it is believed that these changes in the ocean circulation might have or might be the driver of this weakening of carbon dioxide in the Southern Ocean. There's similar evidence in the North Atlantic, so people have also taken measurements of carbon concentrations in the ocean, and what they were able to show is that the concentration or the removal of carbon in the ocean surface slows down. Okay, so there's also evidence in the North Atlantic or in other world region that the ocean sink of carbon is weakening. These studies are very important, but they only provide us snapshots of specific world region. So the question here is there other independent evidence that might show us that the sink of carbon dioxide in the ocean and perhaps also on land is changing? And one suggestion is to look at the fraction of total anthropogenic carbon dioxide emission that remains in the atmosphere. And this is referred to as the airborne fraction. And this is something that is relatively easy to compute because we have very precise measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so we know how it is evolving, how much it grows every year, and we also have estimates of global CO2 emissions, fossil fuel emissions, which are uncertain or which have a certain error, but not a huge error. And then there are the land use change emissions, those emissions that come out of deforestation, out of changes in the way we use land, and those are a little bit more uncertain. But by taking the fraction of the atmospheric growth to the total emission, we get a sense of how much of the emitted carbon remains in the atmosphere. And this is actually a measure of the sinks in the ocean. And what people find is that this sink of carbon is actually or this airborne fraction is increasing with time. So this means that the amount of carbon that remains in the atmosphere is increasing, even though the trend is relatively difficult to detect. So it is relatively likely that the airborne fraction is increasing, but it is also very sensitive to certain assumptions. So this means that probably this trend in the airborne fraction is at the limit of detectability. And then the last or another line of evidence to detect changes in the ocean sink of carbon are models. We can also look at climate models and see how the carbon uptake in the ocean changes as a function of time. And pretty much all models show weakening of the global sink or of the global oceanic sink of carbon. So this means that we have three lines of evidence here. One is direct measurements in the ocean, which support this notion of a weakening sink. Then we have a likely positive trend in the airborne fraction, which also points towards a weakening of these carbon dioxide sinks. And then finally, we have the model results. So the question is, how will the carbon that we emit into the atmosphere be partitioned in the future? And here I'm showing results from the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so all these letters on the diagram, these are all different models. And the black letters, these are the state of these models in the year 2000. And the red symbols are the state of these models in the year 2100. And so what you see here is that these models consistently shift upward and to the left, which means less carbon taken up in the ocean and more carbon remaining in the atmosphere. So what this indicates is that up to the year 2100, it looks like that the sink of carbon will continue to weaken, and a substantially larger fraction of anthropogenic emission will remain in the atmosphere. So let me wrap up. So from up to date, the ocean has taken up a substantial fraction of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. It is 30% if you consider only fossil fuel emissions. If you also consider land use change emission, then the fraction is a little bit smaller than that, but it's still substantial. And there are different lines of evidence that support the notion that the efficacy of the ocean sinks is changing and will change even more dramatically in the future. So what are the knowns and what are the unknowns? So what is relatively well known is the atmospheric CO2 concentration, because we're able to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with very good precision. And also there has been large progress made in estimating the trends in the oceanic carbon sink, but still large gaps remain. So I showed examples from 2 world regions, but the rest of the ocean still remains unconstrained. And so how can we get a better handle on these uncertainties? So first of all, observations of the ocean that can constrain these trends need to be maintained, and they also need to be expanded. Then also, in order to understand what drives these changes, we need to improve our models to represent all the relevant processes. So for example, in climate models at the moment, there's no representation of the effect of ocean acidification on ecosystem, which also affects the sink of carbon. And so what can these improved constraints on trends in the carbon cycle give us? Well, they would greatly improve our ability to predict or to project future changes in the carbon cycle, which are very relevant in order to understand future changes on climate. So I stop here, and thank you for your attention.
So now we've heard a little bit about the physics and getting the CO2 into the ocean, then what happens? So John Gnad is going to talk to us about acidification, and you've heard that as a theme many, many times over the last day and a half. John is a marine biogeographer with the Marine Conservation Biology Institute, and he is a researcher and scientist who has studied the problem of acidification for many years. He's looked at it from the standpoint of the reefs in Australia. He's looked at it from, he actually spent time in Kansas studying acidification from Kansas, and now is with, as I said, is with the Marine Conservation Biology Institute, where he not only studies ocean acidification, but helps us understand and translate that information to the public. John.